Ladies and gentlemen, we have an amazing guest today. He is a New York Times bestseller. I think he might be the first New York Times bestseller I've had in here. He is a doctor, but not the medical kind.
Yeah.
And he is my 1/4 Armenian brother. All right. Without any further ado, we have Preston Sprinkles.
Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being here. You've done a lot of work with this conversation around same-sex marriage, pronouns, the whole bit. And why? Why are you passionate about this topic? And can you pull your mic just a bit closer?
So I would say I fell into the conversation about a decade ago, and it began as simply a scholarly pursuit. Like I wanted to figure out what I believed about the topic, primarily sexuality and same-sex marriage. And so I started just writing and researching and that led me into like dialoguing with a lot of LGBT people. And two things really quickly became kind of true in my journey. Number one, I grew up a conservative Christian but have always like tried to, take my beliefs back to the Bible and say, what does the Bible actually say? I don't want to just rely on my upbringing. I want to know for myself what the Bible says. I want to weigh all the options. And when I did all that, I did end up landing really strongly on a traditional view of marriage. To some people's chagrin, they saw that I was being very open-minded and they were hoping I would be affirming and I went the opposite direction. But then through that, I also saw that like, I think the church has done largely a pretty horrible job in how they've treated LGBT people. Dozens and dozens of just really horror stories from LGBT people who grew up in the church and just had not just like a problem with the theological teaching of the church, but just relational stuff that I'm like, dude, that's just not Christian. You can hold to a traditional view and also be kind and loving and walk with people. And so that just kind of led to this kind of like me being passionate about being gracious and empathetic while holding to a traditional view of marriage. And some people say you can do one or the other. You can't do both. So I spent the last 10 years trying to disprove that. Yeah,
that's great. A quote from Jackie Hill Perry said that Preston's lived experience with the LGBTQ community, along with the theological depth he holds, makes this book a necessity. Regarding your last book, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? Yeah. What does she mean by your lived experience? It sounds like you've built a lot of bridges and have really connected with this. Is that kind of what Jackie's getting at in this quote?
Yeah. There's been good scholarly work on the topic, obviously. Okay. So I would hope that I've contributed to that conversation as well in a healthy way. But I think what hasn't been done as much as, somebody who has, a scholarly approach to the topic, is doing research, who is also listening to stories and walking with LGBT people and spending time and building friendships and stuff. So that's been kind of what I've done from day one is keep this topic relational. Like anytime I even, because my natural default is theology, right? Like I want to go to the Bible, I want to do word studies, I want to win debates, and like that's my default. So to not temper, but like maybe do that more holistically, I've had to really make sure I'm constantly in a relationship with LGBT people, so I don't just, because it'd be easy for me to just keep it as some topic to argue rather than as the title of my last book.
It's easy to dehumanize people
very easy.
When you forget that there's people. Now, do you think that the people are different from what some of us would say are the agendas by the activist? Because Dr. Michael Brown kind of hit me to that, and I was like, oh, that's good. I never really thought about it that way. There's the people, and this is their lived experience, and they're trying to figure it out. And some of them could even be like, look, I might be wrong on this in terms of the affirming crowd and that whole bit. But then there's like the visceral, like, hey, you can't opt out of social studies for your first grader regarding our history, right? Like this is happening in Glendale right now, where I'm not sure if you're keeping up with the protests, but they wouldn't allow the parents to opt out of elementary school teaching history and social studies around gay pioneers. And I'm just kind of like, huh? Like,
was that when the Armenian crowd got?
Oh yeah, you know what I'm saying. You know how the Armenians
I've been
get
around
down,
Armenians,
bro.
man.
You don't
tell Armenians how to parent their kids,
right? No. And so it's like I get the desire to humanize, but then there seems to be a disconnect between the humans and what seems to be
Yes.
the policy
Yes.
that is not always reflective of the humans in that
100%. I 100% agree. In fact, I would say, in my experience, and this is, I guess, anecdotal, but based on, a pretty large sample size, the overwhelming majority of actual LGBT people are not represented well by the very loud activist types. I would say, especially in the trans conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Like the loud activists, the people you see on like What Is a Woman, the documentary, and those people exist for sure. They're very loud, very influential. So I don't want to downplay the significance of some of the ideology and the pressure and the political stuff. But I would say for every 10 trans people I talk to, maybe one might have that kind of activist spirit. Most of them are just some are politically conservative. In fact, I've got several trans friends who are like registered Republicans, or they don't even believe in same-sex marriage, or they don't believe they were born in the wrong body. Like one of my good friends would say, I have a neurological disorder and I just got kind of screwed by nature and I don't know why I had this. And transitioning was a last ditch effort to survive in their point of view.
Wow.
But they would turn around and say, I'm horrified at how all this ideology is being, pressuring teenagers and all the teen stuff going on. And so there's just such a wide diversity of just real human experiences among actual LGBT people.
Yeah.
I would say, in my experience, a small percentage of them would resonate with kind of that loud activist spirit.
Yeah. It also seems like the folks who are engaging with Christians tend to be a bit more charitable, right? Because if you're going to go and debate or discuss or have dialogue, you're probably going to be a bit softer than the folks that are driving. Which is interesting, because I think the one thing that the left does a great job, and I'm using the left in a very general, broad sense, is infiltrating institutions, right? So you have folks in these institutions that are like able to impact policy, and conservatives and Christians, like, we're kind of busy doing this thing. And so that's awesome that you can engage with people. And again, they're not the same as the folks who've infiltrated the institutions.
Yeah. That's when it comes to the institutional level, public schools, colleges, universities, it is very far left. Yeah, especially in any kind of social science, kind of humanities area. Not so much maybe on the engineering departments, or whatever, but like, and it's you go on a university campus and it's going to be very far left. I think that, and these are the people that are, when they get out of these institutions, they're becoming influential people in policy and government and everything. Right. And so that's, I think it ends up becoming a very one-sided issue.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest misconception the average Christian has about the average person from that community?
Oh man, that's almost impossible to answer. I would say an assumption, kind of, I guess what we're kind of talking about. I mean, assumption that all or most LGBT people are like this, and then usually that perception is based on kind of whether they're, if they're watching a lot of like conservative news, then they're going to usually highlight the extremes. And again, like have you seen a documentary, What Is a Woman? Or
so I've watched a lot of the clips, and I keep starting it. Like when they put it on Facebook, Twitter. Yeah. Me and my wife started it, and then like we just didn't get into it because it was like late. I've seen a lot of the good parts, if you will.
Okay. So like that, like he would highlight kind of some of these really extreme views that again are out there, and they are like, you hear people talking like, do people actually believe this? Some people do, but the majority don't. So to answer your question, I think the biggest misconception is that when a lot of Christians think about LGBT people, especially if they don't have a lot of people in their life that are LGBT, they have kind of a one size fits all perception. And then
and that community is not a monolith.
It's not a monolith. Yeah. 500,000 statistically, according to one survey, 500,000 gay and lesbian people believe in a traditional sexual ethic.
Wait, how? Wait, by traditional sexual ethic, you mean?
Yeah, they're religious. They're mostly Christians, or maybe some might be, I don't know.
So meaning they're against same-sex marriage?
Yeah.
What?
They're same-sex attracted, but they hold to a traditional view of marriage. Yeah. I just talked to a guy. He's a therapist here in San Diego, and he said he's probably counseled, I think, over 300 people in this area alone that have a religious commitment, same-sex attracted, and for mostly theological reasons, don't think it's right to act on it. So
it seems like there's a tension that we have to hold between the institutional influences or the agenda, which that sounds like we're about to throw on the Alex Jones, you know what I mean, and talk about the frogs being turned gay and all that stuff, right? So there's like this tension that we have to hold between the people influencing the institutions and writing the policy versus the average day-to-day person living their life. Yeah. And then to go deeper, the people who see this as, this is just who I am, this is what I'm attracted to, versus the people that are saying, oh, and you need to affirm this as the same. And so if Christians, if we're not careful, we can slide into this like hyper paranoia that they're trying to get us. Right. You know? Absolutely. And not to say that there aren't, because there's definitely people that are trying to persuade, but I don't know if it's as common as we perceive it to be. I don't know if it's as like they're coming for your kids, even though those videos of them saying we're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children. Right? There's those videos. But what do you make of all of that tension? You know,
that's probably the hardest thing in the ministry that I do. I mean, this is my full-time job, is helping the church engage this conversation. So it's been interesting, and that I think helping Christians understand that you've got a lot of people probably in your church that are wrestling with their sexuality or gender on some level, that are scared to death to even talk about it. And they're sitting in your pew. So before you go and fight this policy or this, like, let's focus first on like shepherding our people well. And I think that's where, so there was a big survey done. It's the same one that was by Andrew Marin back about 10 years ago now. He did the largest, at that time, sociological study done on the religious background of LGBT people. It's published in a book called Us Versus Us, great book. And that survey showed that 83% of LGBT people were raised in the church.
Wow.
83%. That's crazy.
Whoa, that's a lot.
By the time they turned 18, about 51% end up leaving. But the main reasons why they say they left wasn't actually theological. It was all relational, you know? So all that to say, like, this whole, like, it's those people out there, and then we're the church in here. And people even talk about like, gay people as if that's synonymous with, like, a raging atheist who hates Christianity or something. It's like, it's way more, that person does exist, but there's a lot more diversity within that community.
Yeah, that's good. What do you think, from your conversations, the LGBTQ community's biggest misconception of Christians is?
Yeah, that one's equally interesting. I think they think all Christians are like aggressively homophobic, transphobic, are into like conversion therapy. Are all Christian parents will kick their kid out of the house if they come out as gay. And I heard those stories exist for sure, and those people exist, and it's not a tiny number either. But in my experience, the overwhelming majority of Christians that at least I talk to, that hold to a traditional sexual ethic, they've got huge hearts for gay and lesbian people. And when their kid comes out, they actually have responded relatively well. Or they might do unintentional things that maybe are hurtful, but not intentional. In fact, there's a story, I might not tell it exactly, so I'll say the name, but it was a college president in California, Christian college president, who was building a relationship with a gay activist, like a lobbyist, trying to like one of those activists that was the aggressive type, right? Yeah. Built a relationship, and man, he really broke through to him. But he says, "Hey, why don't you come visit our campus?" And the guy was scared to death because he thought that if he goes on a Christian college campus, Christians would be literally throwing rocks at him, trying to like beat him up with bats and stuff. Like so he was actually scared for his life. Wow. But the president's like, just come check it out. Yeah. And this is like, college students, dude. They're like, you're gay, so what? Like, it's not a big deal, And like, so he came on campus, and he was so utterly shocked that people were kind to him. They were just nice. They just didn't. They kind of yawned when they found out. Oh, so he's a gay lobbyist. Whatever. Like, oh, great. Whatever. Like, what's your name? What's your favorite food? Right. So I think that misperception to all Christians are this, just kind of Westboro Baptist types. Like they're just aggressively after gay and lesbian people. So.
Yeah. It's interesting. I the folks in my life that are from that community that I've been close with, we don't sit down and like talk about their love life. Like we don't sit down and debate these things, you know. Like if they ask, I'll tell them what I think, which is what the Bible says.
Sure, yeah.
If they don't ask, like I'm not like prying, and you know, it's more so about extending dignity and just having relationship with the person, you know, and then I think there's a desire for representation on both ends. Like I think Christians want a healthier representation in those circles. And I bet they would want a healthier representations amongst Christians and how to navigate that. So it's interesting as I just kind of, I'm reflecting on that in my own life and how there's, our brains naturally go to the most extreme caricature of the other side. Yeah. You know, instead of like, well, wait a minute, no. What's the average person? Like, is the average person who's from this community going to be the guy that forces you to make the cake, or forces you to make the website, you know, or is that a smaller percentage that's trying to make an example because, you know?
I think it's a smaller. Do you think it's? I think it's a lot smaller percentage.
I think it's a smaller.
I don't have data on that.
Yeah,
but just in my experience.
For my experience, I would guess it, but it's obviously anecdotal.
Do you think it's what do you think is feeding these kind of extreme assumptions on both sides? Is it the polarized kind of way that news media is done these days, or like people believing extreme stories and thinking that's a norm, or where do you think that comes from, or just lack of relationship with people on the other side?
I think that's probably first is lack of relationship and lack of knowing people, and then I would say there's the convergence of different kind of worldviews and how those worldviews are articulated, you know, and then I would say the media is definitely playing a huge role in it. I think language, for example, right? Like taking the word violence and changing it to mean something that it doesn't mean anymore.
Like what? Like verbal violence?
Like violence against LGBTQ bodies. I don't know of a lot of violence happening against anyone's bodies. Right. You know, like it's such a rare, but we'll take language and we'll change it. Genocide. Yeah. Right. We'll say language will change and then it can just kind of mean whatever you want it to mean. And I think that can then you're going to have you're just going to have an overcorrection on both sides. Even being told you have a phobia. Yeah. My wife has a real phobia of animals.
Really?
Okay. The other day she was outside walking something to the recycling, and the neighbor's dog, came across to say like, oh, your recycling's full. Like, let me know if you want to use mine. And so as she's coming across, her dog runs over and my wife jumps on the hood of her car.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And my little 2-year-old sees it and she's like laughing at mommy, right? That's a real phobia, like a real phobia where your body. And so even taking language like phobia, that's a phobia. You have a phobia. You know, like it instantly otherizes.
Trauma, violence. I mean, these are words like, so yeah. I mean, you brought up genocide. So both of us have you a lot more than me, but some historical connection to the Armenian genocide. Like people have been through actual violence. Or we have friends that came over from America on the wake of the Rwandan genocide. They've been through trauma, right? They've experienced excessive violence. So if that same word that's used to describe that is now being used to describe, you know, for instance, if I give a talk and show what the Bible teaches that marriage is between a man and woman, I get accused of violence. We need a different word because those are two very different experiences. Isn't it kind of insulting to the person that has been through an actual genocide wait, you're comparing my situation with what you went through, hearing a viewpoint you disagree with?
Yeah. I don't want to speak on behalf of other groups, but I have black friends that have said this, like, hey, don't conflate this to civil rights. Like they're not the same thing. But I can only talk about from my experiences. Like I was with my dad last night and we were talking about the pogroms of Baku, which is the reason why we came out here. And so I'm Armenian, but we grew up in Azerbaijan, which Turkey, Azerbaijan is all kind of used to be the Armenian kingdom. And what happened was there was Arzis that came back from Armenia saying that they were refugees and they were kicked out. And so as a response to that, the Arzis in Azerbaijan wanted to push all the Armenians out. And the Soviet Union gave all these regions autonomy, like they're like autonomous, like you're kind of like, it's like a nation state. And so by giving them this autonomous nature, they were allowed to mass export, tons of Armenians from Azerbaijan, from Baku, which is where I'm from.
Yeah.
And my dad was telling me that they had to borrow, because again, the average Armenian and Arzi were friends, right? All in the same neighborhoods. My dad said they had to borrow their friends' police uniforms to get his dad and some other family members and put them in police uniforms and walk them through as they're trying to get to the train to get out of Baku. And in the process, they're talking Arzi instead of Russian or Armenian. And he said they're witnessing people get beat and killed and all this kind of stuff. That's a genocide. That's an attempt of a genocide. You're pushing. I don't know how many of us left Baku. So when I hear language like, the qualifier is like, do you think children should be allowed to get puberty blockers?
Right.
And I'm like, no. You're transphobic. That's genocidal. I'm like, no, stop. Like, what are we talking about? Like, that's not the same thing. And so I think that would frustrate anyone. Like, I think because then it becomes an overcorrection. Because I'm like, you guys are nuts. Like, this is crazy, right? But again, but it's hard to articulate that without coming across as you're now dehumanizing the whole group. Versus, I have an issue with that ideology. I have an issue with an ideology that takes words and makes them mean something else. To your point, has the church been fair to LGBTQ people? Probably not.
Right.
Like probably haven't
on the
been,
whole,
they haven't been the most gracious. Probably haven't been the most charitable. We've probably looked the other way when we know that there are people who are sleeping with their girlfriends, living together, looking at porn, being sexually immoral in every other which way. Yeah. But when it came to this issue, the churches probably came down really hard on this thing. So like, yes, there's been some double standards in this regard. So I just feel like we are then just we're talking past each other.
Yeah. It's kind of a conversation stopper when the other person's accused of being violent or transphobic. Yeah. It's like there's no
or a groomer.
Or
when you come out and you're like groomer, like, whoa, that's a serious accusation,
right? Because you don't engage in a good faith dialogue with somebody who is an actual groomer or something. Right? It's just it ends the conversation. Right. So, it seems to be getting worse. Do you think it's going to get better? I mean, you can't keep throwing around all these huge terms and accusations, and it's got to level out, don't you think? Or or it's just going to keep getting more and more polarized.
I think it's going to get worse.
Before it gets better. And what's probably going to happen is through the election, I think it's going to get worse. I think all this is going to get more and more polarized. And then I think we'll probably, level out somehow. I don't know how, but I think you might see migration. I think you might see people move. Hey, if you're about this and, you want to transit, you want your kid to transition, like you're going to have to figure out a way to get out of Texas or get out of Florida. I think it's going to get, and same thing for people in California. Like if we start finding out like our tax dollars are going towards, injecting kids with puberty blockers, like, like how do we, how do you navigate that conversation? I think some of the extreme ideologies specifically in the trans conversation as it relates to youth, I think are going to be the thing that will end up, I don't want to say cannibalizing the what do I want to say? I think it's gotten too far out of hand, and it has when most older gay and lesbian people are like, we're not into this. Like this is not. And in a lot of European countries, which are more progressive than we are, they're rethinking it all because they've had a good number of females who were like, in their opinion, were rushed through transitioning as a teenager and now paying the lifelong effects of that as young 20-something. And we keep having these cases come up. There was a big one a couple of years ago in the UK that actually won. Like they actually now lifted or they raised the age of puberty blockers because of this case, because she sued the I think the Royal Court and won. And so the whole gender like conversations is now like it's been kicked up so much. Now they're rethinking a lot of things. Same thing in Scandinavian countries, which are very progressive. They're rethinking a lot of things. So I think it's just a matter of time, especially, I mean, money talks. I mean, you get enough lawsuits where people are getting sued for engaging in surgeries that they probably shouldn't have done on teenagers. So I think my prophetic prediction, please don't take this with a grain of salt. I think in the next 2 to 5 years, there's going to be a scaling back on some of the extreme.
I think it'll come down to how common this detransitioning becomes. If that's because right now the data they have is they're saying, oh, it's like 1%. You know, which is like
it
seems like more than that.
It's way.
And so, but if it gets to like 50%, 40%, you know, I think that's when people will be like, okay, like we kind of overdid it on this whole thing. And it's so bizarre because it's all coming from a desire to be empathetic and to extend dignity and all this sort of thing. And it's just like inverted. It's like an inverted virtue that's sort of like, it's like quasi Christian almost.
If I was a steel man, so I'm with you, and we can even talk more about this, but you know, some of the trans conversation as it pertains to youth and medical or hormonally transitioning, like I think that's what makes me the most nervous. Like I'm very much not on board with that. But I think I think that the youth aspect of this is going to change kind of the nature of the conversation. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. So you, I believe, at some point came out on pronouns, and that was controversial. And someone wrote an article. I covered. I don't remember who it was. So forgive me for not knowing the name. But some lady wrote an article and came down and said, Christians who use pronoun, like they basically were like
trampling on the blood of Christ. Is one of the phrases.
I'm like, wait a minute. You know, to be fair, I've never been in a situation where I'm presented with, do I use the pronouns? Do I not use the pronouns?
Okay.
I would venture off to say I would probably just call that person by their name, whatever name they're asking me to call them, you know?
Yeah.
So unpack where you're at with the pronouns thing and how did you come to that conclusion?
Let me begin. There's been more recent articles on it, which is interesting. I published a book on the trans conversation called Embodied, and I have a whole chapter on like bathrooms, pronouns, and so on. And that was 2.5 years ago. And I've written on it before that. So this isn't, I don't know why it's flaring up now, but there's been some recent articles written that I think very much misrepresent or at the very least underrepresent my actual argument. Let me begin by saying I think it's complicated. I think this is not a black and white, here's the right response, here's the wrong response. It is very complicated because language is complicated. And interacting in a secular society with a Christian worldview where language is shared social space between me and my worldview and this person who has a completely different worldview, like the language is that's complex. That's a complex shared social space. So part of my goal is to help people to appreciate the complexity. So wherever you end up landing on it, be a little less dogmatic maybe and be like, try to understand where somebody else is coming from. So I spent like 10 pages on this in my book. The first 5 pages is just that, like showing here's the good arguments for this side, good arguments for that side. You know, the big argument against pronoun use is, you know, you're lying to them, or you're, one of my friends says, I don't want to feed someone's delusion, you know, which I'm like, I get what you're saying. Maybe that phrase isn't, I've never won someone to Christ by calling them delusional, but the other side is that, you know, we're kind of meeting people where they're at, not demanding that they use language in a way that resonates with our worldview. And it's a give and take. Like, and there are certain, I'm a big fan of Orwell's 1984, you know, where language is, when people start manipulating language and forcing people to use terms, like I'm very concerned about that. I'm not naive to that. But on an interpersonal level, I have landed on the view, having thought through it, you know, that I will, in an attempt to meet someone where they're at, use the pronouns they want. Every single so let me say this, every single trans person that I know in my life that came to Christ and ended up either detransitioning, or some weren't fully transitioned anyway, who now are fine using their pronouns that match their biological sex. Like now they're, you know, would identify with their biological sex. Hands down, every single one said if that was forced on me when I first came to Christ, or even not yet coming to Christ, I would have ran the other way. I needed space to wrestle, to be on a journey, to process this new way of thinking, you know. And Christians that didn't even go there with they just used my pronouns. I wanted to be around them, and then we walked to Christ together, and my discipleship started to mature, and then I ended up saying, yeah, maybe I should use pronouns that match my biological sex. So pragmatically, I can make a really good argument that I think it's better in most cases to use someone's pronouns. And I don't think it's necessarily lying to somebody unless I am saying I believe you. Like, so if I meet a biological female, they want me to refer to them as they, them, or he, him. If I'm in relationship, I don't want to give the impression that I actually agree with their view of themselves, but I want to say, okay, I believe pronouns should match your biological sex. That's my worldview. It's what I believe, you know. Hope you're okay with me believing that. Now, as a gesture of hospitality, this is obviously very important for you, so I will use your pronouns, but I don't want to give the impression that I am fully agreeing with everything they believe about themselves. So, and if they demand that I do agree with it, no relationship can be healthy if one party demands you agree with everything they believe, especially if it's something that's not accurate, you know, not scientific. So anyway,
I think
that's the short version of a very long, complex.
I think the complicated part is even the non-binary. I was talking to a friend of mine, and we have a mutual acquaintance that I don't really speak to anymore, and they were telling me that they use this like we they language. That's hard. And he's like, we're on our way, and he's like, wait, who are you bringing with you? And he's like, no, bro, pronouns. And he's like, oh, my bad. You know, and it's like, well, like if you're using this like we they, you know, it almost becomes incoherent at times to even engage in a you know, like if I've like whenever you read an article about someone that identifies as non-binary. And you're like, wait, they? Like, what? Like, hold on. And it's like, oh, no, that's the person's pronouns.
And I don't... One of the biggest questions is how much of this is like medical and scientific and how much is social. And, well, some people use the word trendy. Well, so, you know, my daughter was in a theater class a few years ago, you know, a bunch of 13-year-old girls, you know, and I think she said of the 15 kids, like 13 of them had alternative pronouns. Okay.
Wow.
Now, according to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the latest edition, 2013, 0.014% of people had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, like a clinical diagnosis. It's pretty rigorous. Like they have to match, I forget, 5 or 6 of 10 criteria to be diagnosed with this psychological condition. So when you have like, you know, 50 to 75% of say junior high girls using alternative pronouns, do they all experience clinically diagnosed gender dysphoria?
Probably unlikely.
Could it be socially in certain environments contagious? Call it trendy, call it maybe just social influences at work. I mean, you gotta have your head in the sand to say, oh no, this is all just. So part of me is kind of like, it is difficult. I don't think, especially they, them will catch on as kind of this normal societal thing. It doesn't. God, it's etched in the design of creation, male and female. Creation, our sexes are binary. Okay, personalities aren't binary, but biological sex is binary. So I don't think it's gonna, in my opinion, last very long.
I went down the rabbit hole of the scholarly data we have on this specific conversation, and from what I read is that there's not a lot to support this idea that it's genetic, meaning that if you look at the brain with people who identify with the opposite gender, that there's nothing in their brain matter that shows that their brain is the opposite gender. So if you'd say like, because if this was real and objective and scientific, then you would take someone that's a trans man and their brain would look like, or aspects of his brain would look like a man's brain, right? And the only time that happens is after hormone replacement treatment.
Got it.
So it's like they have to get on testosterone and inject themselves to then develop the characteristics and the brain differentiation. But what is the therapy called? The
hormone replacement therapy. Or There's
no brain difference of a trans brain versus a non-trans.
Well, it is complicated. I have a whole chapter on, it's called the brain sex theory.
Yeah.
And in my book on trans called Embodied, I have a whole chapter, and I spent more time researching for that chapter than any other chapter I've ever written my entire life, because there's been data for, because it's linked to the question that's a 100-year-old scientific question on, do men and women have different brains?
Right.
Even that, there's general differences in things, but you don't. The consensus seems to be that our brains in general are not sexually dimorphic like our bodies are.
Yep.
There are general patterns of difference, but they're kind of based on stereotypes too. Like,
there's definitely stereotypes, but there's also the reality of just testosterone.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like testosterone
that affects your.
So if you have a guy and the average man is walking around with 10x the testosterone of the average woman, which is, if you have a healthy dose of testosterone, that's what it is. That's a huge difference in terms of how you're going to navigate, operate, your degree of competitiveness, your aggression, your sex drive, like all of that stuff is going to be different. Now, to your point, how much can that be shown on a brain scan? Apparently, from the article I saw, that they see it, the brain changing post the hormone therapy.
It's hard because there's been a lot of studies done on it, and they're all can be very highly politicized. So it's almost like you have to read 10 studies and get the rare get a scientist who doesn't have a dog in the fight, which is pretty rare. But having combed through all those, there doesn't even the ones that did argue for brain differences, I think they overreach in both their methodology and like that. Is this post transition, post testosterone? Is it, or even, our brains are elastic. Like New York cab drivers, there was a study done on New York cab drivers that their hippocampus, I think, is bigger than the average person, because life actually reshapes your brain and restructures your brain.
Wow.
So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. Like, did living as a trans identity, is that because of your brain, or did that actually reshape your brain? And it's like almost impossible to tell. So I think people are starting to back off some of the brain studies, because it's just, you can't really prove much from it. But.
Now, it sounds like a lot of what your work does is just advocate for extending dignity and empathy to people from this community. Is that a fair
I would
way?
say half of what I do is that. The other half is theologically defending, articulating, responding to questions around same-sex marriage and same-sex sexuality.
Your background in terms of your doctorate is in New Testament studies, right? So your background is in that, and so half of it is, hey, we need to extend empathy and love to these people. We need to not otherize them and discard them. And then the other half is almost like an apologetic for a Christian sex ethic.
Yes. And I'm not a debater. I'm not an apologist like you are, but I get questions all the time. So in fact, the book that just came out or is coming out, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? It is me responding to all the counter arguments to the traditional view. So
what are some of those counter arguments?
Like,
there's 21 in the book.
21 in the book.
Yeah. What are the most popular? We don't have to go over all 21.
Yeah. One of the most popular ones is that when the New Testament writer, specifically Paul, prohibits same-sex sexual relationships, the only kind of same-sex relationship that was available in the first century were relationships of power and abuse and older men on younger boys. And
he's really condemning pedophilia. He's not condemning what is it? A monogamous, covenantal same-sex relationship.
Right. Yeah. That one it used to be popular among scholars till they realized the data doesn't really support it. But I still hear it.
As if they did not have monogamous homosexual relationships in antiquity.
Well, and to be fair, when it comes to male same-sex relationships, if you look at Greco-Roman literature, you look at the environment, the overwhelming majority were between men of power differences, rape, abuse, master-slave, older man, younger boy. The majority are, but there's exceptions. Well, number one, there's exceptions to that. Number two, female same-sex relationships were the opposite. It was between consenting adults. So in Romans 1, Paul leads with female same-sex relationships and then says likewise the men. So the fact that he also prohibits female same-sex relationships shows that we can't be exclusively thinking of domineering, kind of abusive. And there's nothing in Paul's language.
Yeah.
He isn't concerned about age differences when he talks about these relationships. So
and then I've also heard, and it's Romans 1, and he says it's shameful.
Yeah.
In the same way that it is shameful for a man to have long hair. That's the word that they're using. So he's not saying it's a sin. He's just saying, it's shameful. That's an argument I've heard.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right, because he does bring in nature when it comes to long hair in 1 Corinthians 11.
Right.
Yeah, so that's one argument. Another one is that, one of the ones that comes up is like, well, what about like polygamy in the Old Testament, or like this whole idea of a biblical marriage is kind of super messy all over the Bible, So like why pick on this one or whatever? But it's kind of like a red herring a little bit. It's kind of like, well, it's messy everywhere. So, but I'm like, well, yeah, but if you go back to creation, Genesis 1 and 2, yes, even polygamy was a departure from the creational design. That's Jesus's point in Matthew 19, right?
Right.
From divorce was allowed or whatever, because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning, it was not so. Like Jesus's ethic goes back to the creational design.
Yep.
So that's what we need to do. Follow Jesus's example. So love is love is an argument. Probably the most popular one isn't the traditional view of marriage harmful toward gay and lesbian people? And that's probably the longest response because I wanted to look at both the logic of the argument and also even like sociologically, because people often cite studies of, to try to prove that. So
saying traditional view of marriage, I believe in a one man, one woman relationship covenant. Everything else is out. Friends with benefits are out. Being married in your heart is out. Telling
polyamory,
you, God saying it's okay for you to sleep with your girlfriend is out. All of it is out. Porn, masturbation, all of it is out. And they say that holding to a one man, one woman marriage is harmful towards same-sex marriage.
Yes. It's harmful towards somebody who is gay, is attracted to the same sex, and is trying to follow Jesus. Like somebody who's exploring Christianity, is in a Christian environment, maybe they're committed to Jesus, that if they're told that they cannot marry somebody and have sex with somebody that matches their orientation, then that's harmful. And I give several responses to that. One of the things it kind of does though is it kind of resurrects purity culture type stuff that like until I get married and have sex, like I just can't be a happy person, a fulfilled person. So so I kind of addressed that a little bit in that argument that because to say it's harmful means let's just broaden that logic out. It means if I'm not married to the person I desire, I can't live a flourishing, happy life. Now, purity, we definitely sent that message loud and hard.
Yeah, we tried that
throughout purity culture, and we messed a lot of people up. So the main question isn't, does this seem like a harmful thing? The main question really is it true? Did the Creator who designed us to be sexual beings, what is his design, and how do we know? So try to take us back to Scripture.
What do you feel is? Do you think the argument just strictly from natural law is the one of the strongest arguments? Obviously, what Jesus says is ultimately the final.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. The argument. Romans 1, hard to argue with Romans 1 when there's specific acts being discussed, right? But I think just the practicality of us reproducing as a species to continue our species sounds like a fairly straightforward, hey, natural law just points us in this direction. And that seems like the strongest argument. And I have a rebuttal to it that I'll share with you later. But what do you think about that, just on the surface?
So a lot of Catholic scholars have done great work.
Yeah, I was thinking St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah. And one more recently, Ryan T. Anderson is a conservative Catholic scholar who argues for traditional marriage without quoting the Bible. Like it's all natural law. And it's a good argument. I think for me, I do think that special revelation resonates with general revelation, that God's revealed design and the word will also resonate with creation. We see this in wisdom literature, especially where they're drawing on creation. You know, go to the ant, you sluggard. You can see God has wired creation in a way to reflect his design. So I agree with all that. For me, in terms of like an argument, I do see reliance simply on natural law. There's too many exceptions to the rule that make it difficult, I think, for an argument. Because I think a lot of the intelligent, more progressive people that I talk to, you know, they always point out exceptions, you know, that you know, infertility, marriage and old age, you know, or like, should we even have contraceptions, you know? And, so there's always these kind of like exceptions to the rule that I think can, they just kind of throw a wrench sometimes if you're relying on natural law solely as an argument.
Not solely, but just I mean, just looking at the design of the body parts, you know, and just go, it looks like this was designed in a way. Oh, and a baby comes, you know, like, and obviously not every time the act happens, a baby has to come, but it's pretty straightforward. The only rebuttal I've really heard to that, obviously there's the, you know, what you pointed out, which is like, well, what about old age? What about this? Well, it's, the plumbing is still the same, even if there's not a baby that comes with that. But I've heard like, well, it's not in nature all the time. There's these animals that exhibit these other things. And I'm like, but that doesn't, humans are different.
Are we going to take our sexual ethic from watching animals?
Right. Because animals do all kinds of weird stuff. And some animals eat their own poop. You know, there's all kinds of bizarre things that happen with animals. So I've heard that as like a, but there's these kind of animals that exhibit this as well, you know? And I'm like, but that's a little different than humans, you know? I mean, we can get into details. We probably don't even want to wander into like specific,
like sexual acts or whatever. And but so I would agree that the human body does reflect God's design as revealed in Scripture that resonates with the traditional view of marriage. It is those exceptions to the,
So let me ask you this, and we're going to go to some questions from the Patreon community here. I see the chat, so if you guys got questions, feel free to drop them in. How does a Christian engage with the idea of marriage, right? Because some Christians have taken a more libertarian approach of like, well, it doesn't really affect my marriage. So what does it matter if they're allowed to legally get married?
So in terms of the legal question.
Right? And then there's also others that have been like, well, we took our hand off this and allowed this to happen, and now they're trying to teach to first and second graders in the social studies class the history and how this is the same as heterosexual marriage, right? So where do you land on that? Is it like, do you take a more libertarian approach of like, it doesn't really affect Christians, let them get married, or do you say, but when we open the doors to this, or like it's not optimal to allow this legally to happen? What would you say?
My response is both wet cement and maybe complex. So I'm not going to have a real black and white passionate response, because I think it really deals. Well, we would first need to deal with what does it mean to be a Christian living in a secular society? What is our role, our influence in living in a secular society? I think sometimes, are we trying to take America back for God? Was it ever for God? Are we, or as I say, are we exiles in Babylon? And when Babylon does Babylonian things, are we kind of like, well, it's Babylon. What do you expect? You know, I would lean more
to the latter.
At the same time, I do believe that God's created design is good for creation. So when nations, when peoples depart from the Creator's design, that will not go well, generally speaking. So do I think legalizing same-sex marriage is actually good for a society? No. Did I freak out when it was legalized in 2015? Not really. I kind of yawned in a sense, because I'm like, it's hard enough to live out my Christian faith with the Spirit of God. People that aren't even coming with a Christian ethic, like it's not maybe that's what it is. It's not shocking to me when secular people live out a secular ethic. So that's the tension I battle, and yet I do think the Creator's design is good for creation, but I assume most of creation won't follow that. You know, so what do you? I would love, because I mean, you think more about that intersection of politics and faith and stuff. So I can be convinced either.
I did. I
can. So let me say, I can never vote for something that doesn't resonate with God's design.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah. Well, I'm in California, and the fact that in 2008 California banned it when we voted for it, which is really
that's odd.
This is a trip. Check this out. We banned same-sex marriage in 2008.
Is that Prop 8?
Prop 8.
Yeah.
And we voted in a teenager's right to have an abortion without their parents' knowledge.
In the same year?
The same year, the same vote. So talk about how wild California was at that time, right? Like, we're okay with 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds having abortions and the parents not needing to know, right? Versus, but we were against this as a state, right? Which is really interesting. So I voted against both. I was like, this is both bad. It's both evil. I think there's a tension, legally speaking, if two consenting adults in a pluralistic secular society want to be together, should they not have the rights to, I don't know, file jointly on their taxes? Should they not have the right to bedside death rights or whatever, right? There's certain legalities, having a retirement plan that can be taken, you know what I mean? Like all those things. I think there's a precedent to say, hey, I can't let my faith dictate the legality of other people's relationships. That doesn't seem right? And I would acknowledge that. I don't think that's fair to folks in that type of environment, what they want to do within their personal lives. And then I go, yeah, but you know what? Jesus said, it's like,
like trying to force a Christian ethic on
yes. Now, in terms of like calling it marriage, I definitely think that that's a bit tricky, but I also can see the argument that like we've called a lot of goofy things marriage, there's a lot of folks that shouldn't be getting married that are getting married, but in their natural state, they could at least come to Jesus and then continue staying married and work on their marriage, and that could bring immense glory to God at some point. Whereas if someone's in a same-sex marriage, there's no real room for that, right?
Yeah.
And then it gets even more complicated if there's kids involved and all. You know what I mean? Then I'm just like, holy moly, man! There's just layers on layers. So I would tend to be of the position that there should be some legal protections allowed, while saying let's not call this marriage because that's not what this is.
That seems reasonable to me. Now, like I would probably lean libertarian on most questions that deal with ethical questions. But with marriage, we are now dealing with something that is primarily, first and foremost, a profoundly theological institution. This is where I would prefer that the state would stay out of the marriage conversation.
But the state doesn't, and to be fair, the state rewards families and it rewards having kids to certain degrees. Like there's definitely an incentive structure, whether it's taxes or whatever. So that's where I go. That's complicated. So like if the state is going to be involved, which should they be rewarding? In my opinion, they should be rewarding people staying married longer, having more kids, like there should be practical things that we should be rewarding if the state's going to reward anything. That's kind of how I would like.
So for you, it's just calling it marriage, like call it a civil union, and then
which is where I thought we were all at. I thought everyone was on the same page. Joe Biden, Obama, Hillary. I think everybody was like, they got civil unions, they'll be fine.
Right.
And then all of a sudden it was like, no, it has to be marriage, and it's like, okay, so now you're saying it's the same. It's not the same. Let's not call it the same. It's not the same. It's not the same. So that's kind of how I look at it.
It's interesting. Some of the more radical feminists, many of whom are also lesbians, would almost agree that like they see marriage as a whole a heteronormative institution. Anyways, like why are we fighting to be crammed into this conservative institution anyway? Like let's just do our thing.
I don't get it. I really don't get it. I think it goes back to that line between acceptance and affirmation. I could accept you, I can love you, I could have you over for the barbecue, we can go do activities together, we can hang out, but there's a line between like I accept these things about you versus like I now have to affirm these things about you. If I go to my family's house and they have a couple too many drinks, I could accept that. I'm Armenian, for crying out loud. We came from the Soviet Union, like they drink. But I got to affirm that, I got to go out of the way and say, yeah, you should have another glass of wine while I'm sitting there not drinking anything. Like it doesn't make any sense to me, right? And so like if I don't affirm everything about my own family, what makes you think I'm going to affirm this thing that what you want to call a marriage.
What does that look like? Like for you, would you not refer to, say, a same-sex couple as husband and husband, or would you not use marital language, or would you just concede and say, well, this is the secular society we're living in, so I'm just going to, even though I don't agree with it, I'll just kind of...
Oh, that's a good one. I think it goes back to pronouns, right? Like I would probably say partner.
Okay.
Partner, right? I don't know if I would say husband. That's an interesting question. I've never really thought about it. Again, I haven't been presented with a lot of these dilemmas and how to practically deal with them, you know?
I think a lot of them involve a lot of gray area, and that's what I think we all should appreciate, that we're dealing with this complex interaction, Christians living in a secular society. You know?
Yeah. And so, I don't know. I think it's interesting. What do you make of the affirming theology? And Zach always says a little bit of Jesus is better than no Jesus. Right? Like if there's a little bit of Jesus they're hanging on to by a thread, then it's better than no Jesus. But then the argument could be made that it's a counterfeit Jesus. Is it the Jesus of the Bible, right? If you're holding on to this Jesus that allows you to do anything and live any kind of way, right?
Yeah.
Is that the authentic Jesus?
That's another... I go back and forth on that. I would probably lean more towards the latter, that... having a distorted, if it's a distorted view of Jesus. No, so I want to make a distinction here between, like, I know people who are affirming, they affirm same-sex marriage, but everything else about their theology, their life would feel very just almost evangelical, you know? They talk about the gospel, they talk about repentance, they just have a disagreement on this ethical question. Now I'll be the first one to say, this is a significant disagreement. Yeah. This is chapter 20 in my book. Is this an agree to disagree issue? And I say, I don't think it is. I think this is a very important part of the storyline of Scripture, is the basic essence of what marriage is. Yeah. So it's not a minor disagreement, but if somebody says, I get this question a lot, parents saying, my kid's affirming, and they want to go, the only kind of church they can go to is an affirming church. Is that a good thing, you know? And I want to make a distinction. If it's a kind of church where Jesus is hardly mentioned, it's just a social club, there's no residue of the gospel at all, I almost see that as more dangerous. Better to not, versus maybe an environment where they are hearing the word of God, they're not getting just affirming messages every Sunday, you know. But I say, okay, that I think is probably better than no church at all. But to be in a church where the gospel is just either so distorted, I think that can almost be worse than not being a church at all, personally. But I could change my view tomorrow. I don't know.
That's I got a buddy that I'm going to have on that more or less affirms all the essentials of Christianity and the early creeds, but he is affirming. Yeah. I'm just like, I don't know what to do with you, man. Like, I don't know what I categorize. Now, I think this is a parallel, so forgive me if sounds like I'm all over the place, but I think someone that doesn't affirm Jesus as God Almighty is following a counterfeit Jesus, right? So if you're like, Jesus was a lowercase g God. Yeah. Jesus was created. Jesus is not God eternal. Jesus is not Yahweh, right? I think I go, ooh. Right. That's tricky, because we see Jesus taking on all the attributes of God Almighty repeatedly. You see Hebrews 1 refer in the Psalm that Hebrews 1 is referring to. It's Yahweh talking to Yahweh, right? And so we see this. So I would go, man, if someone is not affirming Jesus as Yahweh, they're probably following a counterfeit. And I would hope that they would repent and land in the right place. So that's where I go with this issue. It's a tricky one, because you might be following the Jesus of Yah, like the Jesus is God Almighty, but this is such a huge kind of distinction that people make with their theology, and it becomes tricky. Yeah,
in most cases. Again, anecdotal, but like in my experience, when evangelical churches shift their view on marriage, in many cases at least, I've seen they do. And I'm not a slippery slope guy. I don't like always using the argument. In this case, it is, again, anecdotally mostly true that other, I would say, important theological commitments end up kind of going by the wayside. Yeah, in my experience,
I've seen people start from this point and then get to the point of, the bodily resurrection even happened? I don't know. Maybe it was a metaphor. You know, oh, okay. We've completely deconverted off the rails. You know?
Yeah. Man, I don't know how, like, they consist again, not trying to use a slippery slope as an argument, but just as a logical deduction. Like I don't know how you can affirm same-sex marriage and not also affirm polyamory more than, multiple partners consensual in a marriage. If it all comes down to harm and consent, and if this is a consenting threesome, foursome, or whatever, what makes, you've already said that when the two become one flesh, it doesn't need to be male and female. Why does it need to be two anymore? Then, so I used to say this a few years ago, and people were like, slippery slope, you're just fear monger. I'm like, but now it's like I'm getting the same people saying, oh, I'm having what we were going through with the LGBT conversation 5 years ago. We're now going through with polyamory because we're getting thruples and people coming to church now and claiming this is an orientation and this is how God made all the same kind of arguments. So
I see that way more prevalent. I see that a lot more prevalent, especially in the men's rights spaces. I don't know if you're familiar with the red pill and all that. I mean, there's a lot of dudes out there that feel entitled because they think they're a high value man to have multiple partners, and that's. I mean, it's borderline going mainstream.
Is that like Andrew Tate?
Andrew Tate, Andrew Tate. And then there's like this weird overlap with Islam, because you could have in certain sects of Islam, you could have up to 4 wives. And so there's some overlap there. But no, there's a lot of guys that are like, I mean, I feel like I can take care of multiple women. What's the big deal? And that's definitely being more and more mainstream. I got a buddy, an acquaintance who was in a situation where they attempted that because he found out that the person he was with was, had same-sex attractions. And so they attempted this like scenario, and it just blew up and was really, 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 really bad.
That's the most common scenario that I've seen is usually like a heterosexual. Oftentimes it's been a guy and his wife or girlfriend comes out as bisexual and says, I need a same-sex partner to fulfill. So it becomes kind of a same-sex relationship and then an opposite sex. And then it can kind of go anywhere in many different directions from there. But
I think those aren't going to end well.
But
let me bounce this off of you. This is an interesting one. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. So there are parts of the world, and I think Got Questions did an article on this. So this is not me like pontificating off of but Got Questions, which is a fairly conservative site, had an article about polygamy and how there are parts of the world where polygamy is legal, and there is a gentleman who has multiple wives, gets saved, and the question becomes, does he need to end those? and how does he end those? And how does he... Is it the first one that's the only one, or is it his favorite? Right? Like, is it the one where the kids are the smallest? Right? How do you navigate that conversation? And I got questions. I should really look this up so to make sure I don't misquote them. But Got Questions basically landed at like, it's kind of a question of conscience for him and his environment. Can he financially provide for all of them? Are they all okay? And what do you think of that? While you answer that, I'm gonna look it up just to make sure I'm not butchering questions.
I actually had a friend of mine, missionary, who was a missionary to northern Nigeria back in the 60s, and apparently, I don't know if it's still the case, but it was a polygamous society, and he faced this exact question. He had people coming to Christ who had multiple wives, and so he had to wrestle with it. One of the things he said is that what makes this complex is it's so etched into the fabric of society. You're not dealing with just some individual living in some sinful life. You're dealing with the fabric of society. And you mentioned it in passing. It's not that he's just it's not like primarily even a sexual thing. It's a power thing. It's also a prestige thing. It's also an economic thing. He's got these women who are being supported financially, and if he just dropped them all, you would have this huge other issue. So the mediating position they took is, I think they worked towards, I don't know if it was like an instant, like here's the demand, but it was working towards him having one of his wives as a sexual partner. So he's being sexually faithful to her, abiding by a sexual ethic, but not divorcing other women, but just keeping them, like supporting them, you know?
Yeah.
So they're still living in the house, they're doing household chores and everything. Because that was another thing he said, oddly enough, in his experience, it was the first wife who asked for another wife because in a very patriarchal kind of culture, she had all this housework, all this stuff, and she just wanted help. She also wanted someone to talk to, because in that culture, it wasn't like the husband's coming home listening to her feelings. And so it wasn't, it was complicated, man. It was, so you have to understand the cultural and societal complexity of it. But I think that's probably the approach I would take.
Yeah.
Trying to balance being faithful to a Christian ethic, but also
be intimate with one wife.
Yes.
But,
and who do you pick?
Yeah. Well, let's look at what God Question says. So this is a trip. So let me show you the question real quick. This is I wasn't expecting this answer. I think they're more progressive than you are. And God Questions is extremely conservative. If a man has multiple wives and became a Christian, what is he supposed to do? So if a man has multiple wives and became a Christian, what is he supposed to do? If polygamy is illegal where he lives, he should do whatever is necessary to submit to the law while still providing for his wives and children. If polygamy is legal, but he is convicted that it is wrong, he should divorce all but one wife. Again, he must not neglect providing for all of them and their children.
So the divorce, he's still providing. He's just technically not married. Okay.
Yeah. They are his responsibility. If polygamy is legal and he has no conviction against it, he can remain married to each of his wives, treating each one with love, dignity, and respect. A man who makes this decision would be barred from church leadership, but it cannot be said that he is in explicit violation of any command in Scripture.
Yeah, I would disagree with that last part,
but it cannot be said that he is in violation. So you would disagree with that?
I would disagree with that, because I think people take kind of and I don't want to assume this about the author or whatever, but like they take kind of a flat view of Scripture of like, well, it's allowed in the Old Testament, and it's not outrightly condemned in the New Testament except for, you can't be an elder, right? First Timothy, Titus. But again, I think the allowance in the Old Testament was a departure from the creational design, and Jesus under the new covenant takes us back to the creational norm. So rather than looking for, is it commanded like as in thou shalt not, we also need to look at just God's design as a whole, rather than is it sin, not sin, is there command, is there chapter verse?
Yeah.
Clearly,
what is the virtue ethic being preached, not what is the letter of the law.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's good.
So I think the command isn't in the form of a command in the Greek language specifically, but when Jesus takes us back to creation, saying one man, one woman, one flesh union, I think that's the standard,
Well, you're more conservative than Got Questions, my friend. Got Questions is out here saying, look, man, if you ain't convicted, live and let live.
I'll get back-to-back emails accusing me of being too conservative, being too liberal. Like it's so funny. I'll hear assumptions about what people think I believe. I still have people to this day that think I affirm same-sex marriage. I've written 2 or 3 books saying not that, So anyway, it's funny. So for my audience that thinks I'm going liberal, there you go.
Yeah, it's an interesting question though, right?
It is. It's really good. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna go to some of these questions, and then I want to ask you an offline question that's probably way too spicy.
Okay.
For YouTube. Okay. If I have a Christian or Catholic LGTV people, we say LGTV because we can't say LGBTQ on
Is
live
that why
on
you
YouTube.
do that? I was wondering why.
Yeah, and I have an affinity for LGTV TVs. All of our TVs are LGTVs.
I did not know that. That makes a lot of sense. I was like, how do you not know the acronym when I'm listening to your podcast?
We speak in code, yeah. LGBT people, what books should I direct them for the softest approach? Or what is the best scripture to be gracious but firm in stance?
I mean, I abhor self-promotion. Okay?
It's okay.
But I would say other people, if I can get in this head of how other people answer this question, I think my book, People to Be Loved, is exactly that. It's a theological exploration. So it's like 70% like working through the text, but woven throughout is loads of stories that we've shared. I mean, the whole first chapter, people thought I was going affirming because I was talking about gay people committing suicide in the church, and we need to do better, all this stuff. And then I said, okay, let's look at what Scripture says. So yeah, it has been kind of a go-to book for people under that category.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, well there you go, you guys. Matthew, pick up the latest. What was that book called?
People to be Loved: Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue is the subtitle.
That's good. That's good. Okay, this is a question I have for you. What do you make of Andy Stanley being ambiguous on this question and seemingly saying some things privately?
Yeah.
With multiple, we've had multiple elders come out and say this is what he said privately. He's open to doing one of these marriages, but publicly he says don't take people's church from them by coming out as affirming. You got to be wise, and it seems like he's kind of playing both sides. And then seemingly there's some affirming theology around kids that come out in the church. Seemingly, I don't want to speak too firmly, and so it's like it seems like he kind of wants to play both sides of it. I don't think that serves the people of his church well, if he's on the kind of like this ambiguous position, and I don't think it serves that community well if they're not sure exactly where he lands on it. Okay. What say you?
So let me give a few qualifications up front. Number one, I don't think I've read more than 20 pages from Andy Stanley book. I maybe listened to a couple messages, so I don't follow him. From what I've heard and seen, from what I have seen, have a lot of respect for him as a Christian leader, as a communicator. He's off the chart from what I've seen. And I've known people that have known him personally, and some of the criticism he's gotten. I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, I don't know if he quite said that. Like, I think you're taking that in the worst possible direction. Yep. So I find myself, in my heart at least, kind of like, well, maybe more standing up for him. Even the recent clip that went around, that 2-minute clip from something he said about gay people having more faith than other. I'm like, if I look at the heart of what he's trying to say there, I'm like, I probably agree with what he's trying to say there. Like, I'm like,
if a gay person is coming to a church they know is not affirming, that shows a lot of faith.
Yeah,
right? That's kind of,
or even like,
because I could hear it that way. I understand what you're saying.
And I think he was even saying like, look, if I ask for volunteers, and he didn't make a distinction affirming or not. He's like, I'll ask the church and I get hardly anybody, and I'll ask gay people and I get lines out the door. People don't want to serve. And I think it was almost like this, like, hey, you people who are all, criticizing gay people, like, well, you step it up because they're the ones jumping in. Anyway, I in my best reading of that, I was like, okay, I think he's saying a lot of things here that I wouldn't disagree with. And so having said all that, I think he's, I think he could be absolutely more clear. And I've been around this conversation enough. It feels like so many people I know that were raised conservative, and then they kind of, their eyes are open to how the church has really messed up gay people, and then they go affirming. I'm not saying he's that. I don't know enough. I'm not saying he will be that. I'm saying he looks like he's doing just that because he doesn't have that theological clarity, to my mind, that he's at least publicly expressing in the clips and stuff that I've seen. I would say my biggest concern, or just something I'm just not really impressed with, is his church is hosting a conference on parents with LGBT kids. Okay. And our organization has produced resources. A huge part of our ministry is helping parents navigate this. But last time I checked, most of the speakers at that conference were all very publicly and some pretty aggressively affirming. I would go so far, and I've hosted some of these like scholarly debates where you have people on this side, that side, and I'm not against having diversity of opinion under a certain format, but I didn't see much diversity here. There was like one kind of conservative person, but they weren't a theologian, but then now all these like theological equipped people who are affirming. I'm like, this is utterly unless you're just appealing to parents who are affirming or whatever. If that's what you're doing, then say it, and I could disagree with, but respect kind of what you're doing. But this just looks utterly confusing, and I think it's very unwise. I've had people that in my ministry say, parents with gay kids, saying, I was incredibly disappointed. This is not helpful for a parent when there's not theological clarity. And again, if you're affirming, then be affirming.
Right.
But when you say you're non-affirming and then host a conference with a ton of affirming speakers who are going to sway the audience, like it's you're going to get an affirming perspective, then I just don't think that's helpful at all. So
yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
I saw that same conference thing, and I was
Yeah.
like, man, I've read Andy Stanley's Deep and Wide. I thought it was a really good work.
okay, yeah.
I read Communicating for a Change.
Thought it was that's the one I read. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's done a lot of really good work. So I was kind of taken aback when he's like, I'm hearing all this stuff, and then you're seeing kind of like the breadcrumbs of like,
Yeah.
and I'm really just like, man, just come out and own it. Like if this is what you're on.
I hope it's not this. I hope it's not closeted. He's affirming, but he would lose a ton of people and money and church building. I hope it's not power and money and platform and size of church that is preventing him from coming out as affirming. I just don't have. I can imagine that would be a hard decision, but I'm like, again, like you said, just if this is where you're at, then be where you're at, and I can agree to disagree,
Yeah.
But I think the unclarity is clarity is kindness, and this is a big thing in when I help leaders work through this. I'm like, wherever you're at, just be consistent and be clear.
Amen.
When you're not clear, it's not people. It just confuses people. So
Yeah, that's good. Okay, I got 2 offline questions I want to ask you. Shout out to Memes for Jesus for just joining the stream. He said Preston is the GOAT. That's my guy. Do you have anything else you want to hit on the public section of our conversation?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Would encourage people to check out my latest book. I wrote it to help. I think there's so many people were coming to me saying, how do I respond to this? How do I respond to that? What about this? I'm reading this argument. I heard the word homosexual was added to the Bible, 80 years ago. Is that true? So I wrote this as a resource to help people respond to all those questions.
That is, the original word was effeminate men, which is probably harsher than homosexual, right?
All of them are. So the Greek words arsenokotes and malakoi in 1 Corinthians 6:9, and there hasn't been a great English translation of those 2 Greek terms until the last decade or so. The CSB, ESV, and CSB do a good job. The new NIV does a good job. Anyways, it's
what would be a better translation? For
a male who is having sex with another male.
Okay.
Yeah, or a man having sex with another male is what I would say.
Someone that is practicing.
Is engaging in a same-sex sexual relationship. And this is where a lot of people's concern, this is my concern with conservatives, they'll quote this passage saying, see, gay people won't inherit the kingdom of God. I'm like, well, this isn't talking about gay people, as in my friends who are committed to celibacy out of allegiance to Jesus, but would still refer to themselves as gay. It's not talking about that. It's talking about somebody who is in an unrepentant, active, same-sex sexual relationship. Or opposite. I mean, the whole passage talks about all kinds of ongoing unrepentant sin. So
yeah, that's good.
Yep.
All right, guys, we're going to go over to our Patreon exclusive. If you want the full version of this interview, there'll be an exclusive section on Patreon. I'm going to ask Preston 2 more questions. One is going to be about maps, which is way too spicy to talk about on YouTube. If you guys don't know what maps are, you could Google it, okay? And the second
or don't.
or don't. And the second one is going to be about him kind of having Matt Chandler's back in the middle of all the controversy with Matt Chandler a little while ago, all right? So meet us over on Patreon for the rest of this conversation. Okay, so the Matt Chandler thing, I sent you a DM a while ago, just giving you a heads up. I was going to use something you put up on Twitter, and I believe at the time he was booked to come to your conference, and I
didn't put it up. It was leaked.
It was leaked.
It was a private message to my patrons, and somebody leaked it.
Okay. And so just kind of what transpired there, and what did you make of that whole situation? It sounds like Matt called his own foul, preemptively submitted to his elders, and it was an example of how to deal with a situation like that. So what did you make of all that?
It was I think Matt on several occasions has been wrongly accused, misunderstood, taken out of context, or just stuff just flat out made up. And I always, I've got a relationship. I wouldn't call him like a good friend. Like whenever we see each other, we get along just really well. But whenever something flares up, I always call him immediately. I'm like, hey, give me the scoop. What's going on? So that's what I did with this situation.
Yeah.
What it was he was, the elder. It came out that he was behaving, I forget the wording, inappropriately or something.
Coarse gesturing.
Coarse jesting. Coarse joking or whatever it was. With another female.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I read that, I was like, oh, this doesn't look good. So I had about a half-hour conversation with him, and he told me all the details. He's a very honest guy. He doesn't hide anything. He told me the whole story. I'm like, that's it?
Mm-hmm. It was like a joke about alcohol or something.
A joke about alcohol.
Yeah.
I'm like, I use that joke probably every day. And I've been around pastors behind closed doors that say way more stuff that could be borderline, if not, of course, And I'm like, okay, so what was it inappropriate? And it's like, wow, I was DMing her family friend, like her wife knew it, no, everybody knew, and there was no emotional, no flirting, nothing like that. It was just her friend, the friend he was DMing, had a really strict like Billy Graham rule to where no married man should ever be texting or DMing another married woman.
Yeah, and
it was the friend that kept raising all this stuff, raising stuff. And after church, I think she even like
confronted him. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this is still so I might not be recalling the details exactly as they are. So I want to be careful here. But it basically from what I can tell, he violated the Billy Graham rule, which everybody these days is telling me should be violated. Yeah. In my world, at least, the Billy Graham rule is like taboo. Like you just think women are just, sexual objects and sexual, we're just all going to jump into bed together. And what about women missing out on this kind of stuff, bro talk. And so he was just, he was a little too chummy with another married woman. His wife knew it. Everybody knew it, but it was the friend that really had a problem with it. And so he immediately told the elders saying, hey, this congregant, brought this up and I, I'll submit to you. And then they made a decision to kind of take it as severe, like err on the side of let's respond as on the more severe side, and maybe he did violate, like maybe I think they have some really strict rules for pastors there. So I think he may have actually overstepped the line with regard to the own standards that church has for pastors. Okay. So, I think he did everything exactly what we keep wanting celebrity male leaders to do. Right. Submit to your elders.
Right.
Don't get defensive.
Right. Have elders.
Have elders.
That can point you to the side.
So it is sad that I think he's been accused of other things in the past, mishandling an abuse situation where they immediately went to the cops and they basically did everything we're telling mega churches should do. And I think people are after red meat, and he is red meat. He's a white, straight, male, conservative, mega church celebrity, all these things that everybody hates these days. But in my opinion, in my experience, he's actually one of the good ones. And it does bother me when he's being taken out because anyway, so I had some speakers drop out because they didn't want to share a platform with Matt Chandler. And I told them, I said, look, I've looked into this extensively. If he was in sin, I would cancel him tomorrow. I would say no. And I have done that with some people in the past, actually. But I don't care what the perception is. I don't care if nobody comes to this conference because they think he's in sin. Yeah. He's not. He's just flat out not. He's doing everything right. Why would I penalize somebody, cancel him because he's doing everything right? So, so I was on sabbatical. I was leaving on the airplane to France where I was on sabbatical, and I sent a message to my patron supporters and
that's what leaked. And
next thing I land in France, and I was gonna be off Twitter for the next 2 months, but I happened to check it, and I was like, oh hell! Like apparently, I think I immediately text Matt, called the church, apologized, and then I didn't check Twitter, so I don't even really know what. But I saw it really blowing up. I was like, this is. Because I was sharing information that I wasn't privy to share. That wasn't public at that time. So that's I remember you. I checked.
Well, I reached out because I was just like, hey, because this was frustrating to me. The narrative that was taken was this: there's no way all that happened was some DMs on Instagram, and if that's all that happened. That's patriarchy and it's toxic masculinity that anyone would see an issue. So I'm like, dude, he's damned if he does. He's damned if he doesn't. If it's just that, he did everything that he should have done as a caution to honor the elders and his, he could have just blew that lady off and been like, you don't know what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
We're all friends. This is the homie's wife. You're tripping. He could have done that. He didn't do that and practice caution and either way still got penalized for it. And so that was the frustrating part. And so you were like the only little bit of information floating around there about some of the details. And I was like, man, this is nuts.
The assumption that it must have been worse was the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And this is why I talked to at least one or two people at the church. So I talked to Matt, but I also wanted to get other third-party perspective.
Yeah.
And I got the impression that they did err on the side of, admittedly, like, we don't want to be accused of taking this too lightly too. So we're going to err on the side of kind of the strongest. In my opinion, I think the messaging was not done. I don't think it was done well, in my opinion. Now, I'm not a part of the church. I could totally, that's just, again, it truly is my opinion. But when I read the messaging, I was like, oh, then when I got the details, like, this sounds of course I would assume.
Yeah. So did he end up still speaking at the conference? Or did
yeah.
Wow.
The first, and then we do live audience Q&A.
Yeah.
I told them in the green room, I said, hey,
they're going to bring this up.
I know you're not even talking about this. You're going to get questions. And I can already see questions coming in.
Yeah.
And he's like, dude, I'll be as
and
honest.
He talked about that at your conference?
Yeah.
Wow.
He talked about other things too. People were like, the first question was like, is Matt the right person to be speaking on the future of the church when he said da-da-da? So he was able to respond saying, okay, here's the context in which I said. I did not say that. I forgot what the issue was. That was a different issue. They made it they just spun it in the worst possible light. So he was able to correct, saying, here's what I actually said, which is almost the opposite of what your little snippet in your question implied. So he responded to 2 or 3 of those.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. I've always been a fan of Matt Chandler. I think he's just always been solid. I remember him on the Elephant Room with Verdict. I thought was amazing. Him preaching at Code Orange Revival was amazing. So I've been following him for quite a bit, and he's always seems to have been
he's extremely down to earth, normal, does not think of himself like you would assume a celebrity pastor would, and has tons of integrity. Yeah.
Okay, last question. This is the big one. So I'm sure you're familiar with MAPS.
No, so what is that?
Okay, so MAPS are minor attracted.
Oh, yeah.
Excuse me, minor attracted persons are trying to categorize this as its own orientation.
Right.
And I remember when this conversation was initially sparked, a lot of the reasons why people were against same-sex marriage, a lot of the reasons why people were against this in general is like, hey, if we give them this, the next thing is going to be pedophilia. The next thing is going to be bestiality. The next thing is right. Yeah. And so it's like polygamy, right? Which we're seeing polygamy, and now there are some fringes, far end of the spectrum, not a part of the LGBTQ community, but there are people that are coming out and saying this is a natural orientation, this is a natural thing. Kids, should be allowed to consent. Yada yada yada. Do you see the correlation between same-sex marriage and minor attraction? This is why we did this offline. For Patreons only.
Oh, man. Okay, so where do I start? First of all, the comparing, you're not doing this, but let me just say generally, comparing same-sex relationships to pedophilia or bestiality. And I'm aware that sometimes the prohibitions occur in the biblical context, like Leviticus 18, where these things are mentioned in the same paragraph, but that has produced a lot of shame in among gay people. So I personally, I just really stay away from like drawing analogies or even that slippery slope argument, because you're seeing as same-sex attraction is like 2 steps removed from bestiality, and there's just been a profound shame among well-intended, like solid Christian people who happen to have same-sex attraction that have been really genuinely shamed by that. Anyway, so that's my caveat. I state the obvious. I think that's a horrible sin, right? To engage in a sexual relationship with a minor. Here's what's interesting is you mentioned the term orientation. We would need to really unpack what we mean by that, because orientation has been accepted as a term in society as a positive, an intrinsically positive thing. But if we mean by orientation that somebody has an unchosen, innate kind of desire if that's orientation that typically lasts your whole life, then, and this is well documented in the scientific literature, there are people who have this desire toward younger people or toward older people. So if we take orientation not as an intrinsically good thing, but simply a way of explaining people's sexual desires, some might be good, some might be bad, some might be horrible. Like then young being attracted to younger people on a sexual level would be categorized as an orientation. In fact, a secular gay sexologist is the expert on this, James Cantor, and that's exactly what he said. The scientific data is there. The overwhelming majority who engage in pedophilia are only attracted to younger people. Now, he'll say it's wrong, it's horrible, it's bad, but like he would say it's an orientation. If by orientation we mean in a unwanted attraction.
Yeah, when Elon Musk came out and said cisgendered is now a slur on Twitter.
I saw that.
There was a lot of people.
Was he being serious about that?
I don't know. He's always I don't know. But there were people that pointed out that the person who coined the phrase cisgendered was a German psychologist who also advocated that it's natural to be attracted to kids.
Yeah, is he talking about No, he's not.
Kinsey was one of them. Kinsey had some freaky views as well.
Freaky guy.
It was a different guy.
John Money might have been who we were thinking of.
I think it was.
Most of these guys, and I'm not what's that logical fallacy of in fact I think I heard it from you, like if the origin of an idea,
genetic fallacy.
Yeah. So I want to avoid that, because some people have used that saying, well, look at the people who invented gender and cisgender, and they're all these people pedophiles and stuff, but it is factually true. Yeah, a lot of these guys in the 70s and 60s and 70s, John Money and other people, or even who's the French philosopher Foucault, who's like a hero in like, dude, he signed a letter, if I remember correctly, trying to legalize pedophilia. So yeah, these are not like morally, admirable people. So yeah. The dividing, using the term gender in distinction from biological sex comes from the late 60s and 70s. John Money was the first one to make that distinction.
Yeah, and then had some other views, right? So again, not to fall into the genetic fallacy, but it's definitely interesting. So again, it just gets into like, how conspiratorial do we want to get? It's like all these things are being pushed through, and now we're like, now we would have never thought trans would be the issue that it is now with kids, and now it's like, is the agenda to get kids to a point where they no longer they can be viewed as if they can consent, because if they can consent to taking life-altering drugs at a young age, can they consent to other things? Like that. Like if we were to be conspiratorial, and not good faith, that's kind of the argument.
My prediction is I don't think something like MAPS would become mainstream. This is where the slippery slope. I think it's like, I think that's a hard sell. There's way too many very, very liberal secular people who were not on board with like that. That still is kind of a fringe. Do you think? I do, possibly lowering the age of consent from like 18 to 16 or something. I think I could see the logic of that, because we're doing that with surgeries and stuff. So
I mean, that would be step one, right? Like, hey, because of this reason, we're going to lower this to 16 or whatever. Yeah. And I think there are some states that have it like a 17 or 16.
Oregon is all the way down to like 15. A 15-year-old, I think it's 15, can go in and get, without parental consent, top surgery and or hormones for sure.
Okay, but I'm talking about consent to have intercourse.
Oh, right. Yeah, so I don't know the law on that.
That's crazy. Yeah, but there are states, I think it was like, I think there's a couple states at 17, some that are 16.
Okay.
Yeah, it's wild. So interesting times, man. Interesting times.
Yeah.
All right, Preston, thank you so much, man.
Yeah, man. Thanks for what you do, man. I love your show. I'm a big fan. Listen to it. I love when I check my app and I got like, you'll release like 5 episodes. I'm like, dude, I got some catching up to do here. So
the new book.
Yep. Does the Bible support same-sex marriage? 21 conversations from a historically Christian point of view.
And that is available
August 1st. You can pre-order it now whenever this comes out.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Peace, guys.